What's that look?
I don't know. I was listening to the Zoom person saying recording in progress, and I was like, American accent. I wonder
Wait,
why they
mine's
don't.
British.
No.
Well, it's not recording in progress.
Yeah.
No, you're
You
right. It
say
is American.
progress. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I do that all the time where I hear something and I can't tell if it's American or British until I really stop and think about it. You'd think it would be much more
Yeah.
instinctual than
Intuitive.
that.
Because you listen
There
to
was
me too
someone
much.
in our community that you mentioned earlier, and I was like, is that person British or American? Even though I've heard them speak loads of time. And it took me, I had to think about it for a
That's like
while
your
and go,
visual thing,
yeah.
but
Well,
with
that's audio
sound.
because I'm trying to listen to her voice. I don't know that's anything to do with aphantasia.
Well, it's almost like the audio version of it.
But yeah,
That's what it
just on
is.
the aphantasia front, to anyone listening who doesn't know, I have aphantasia. I don't have a mind's eye, so my visual recollection is terrible. My friend, we were talking because somebody made a comment on my YouTube channel that I needed to go and see a good orthodontist, and I was having some thoughts about it. So I was talking to my friend about it, and she mentioned something about her mole and how she felt about her mole and people commenting on her mole. I've been friends with this person for a couple of years, and I'm thinking, she's got a mole. Like, never noticed that she's got a mole. Stand by, Steph. It gets worse. So I tell her this, and I'm laughing because I never even noticed that you had a mole. I couldn't even say where it was. So then, anyway, when she sends a reply, she sent voice notes, but she sent a photograph of herself. And on the photograph, she's got her finger like that on her face. And I'm like, oh, very funny. She's covering up her mole, like acting like, well, kind of what mole? You can't see it. And it wasn't until I listened to it when she says in the message that she's pointing to the mole, and then I could see the mole that she was pointing to. So even
Wow.
and that feels something beyond aphantasia because
I
that is not
agree.
visual recall. It's almost like,
Correct. Ignoring something.
yeah, it's being unobservant.
Or that even our interpretations of that is different. Like one is like a lack of awareness and one is an intentional lack of, like, interesting. What do you make of it?
It's just, well, I used to always call myself unobservant because I'd go in and a friend could have redecorated and I wouldn't notice, or someone could have changed their hair color and I wouldn't notice. And then when I found out about aphantasia, I was like, oh, that's why. That's why I don't notice this stuff. And then things like this happen, and I'm like, that's good. That's good.
It's
I
some
feel
kind
like
of
it's a double
defense
whammy.
system.
There's a double whammy in there.
I think
So
so
yeah,
too. Thank you for sharing.
no problem. I have no idea how this will relate.
We can't segue this. It's okay. People can just listen to us in the beginning and then we'll just plug on. We're talking about relapse today.
Yes, we are. I was thinking, ever since we planned on doing this episode, I was thinking about my training, and they talked a lot. This is my eating disorder practitioner training.
Ah,
They talked about lapses and relapses.
eh,
And so the lapse being, kind of once or twice, and the relapse being full blown right back in eating disorder or disordered eating. And so part of it was working with the client or patient with lapses because it often starts, for me anyway, I would go through a period of time where maybe I felt, kind of okay around food, wasn't really binging. And then, oh, I feel like I would kind of overdo it a bit here. And that felt like a bit of a lapse, but it's okay. I can get myself back. But then the next one would be a bit bigger. And sometimes it felt like it wasn't like I didn't binge for a few weeks and then I had a massive binge. It was almost like I wouldn't binge for a few weeks and then there'd be a bit of compulsive eating and then a bit more compulsive eating and then a full
yeah.
blown binge. So I just wanted to make that distinction as well, because I think a lapse in the moment, the more you catastrophize a lapse, the more
Yes.
likely you are to trigger it into a relapse, full blown relapse.
This topic to me also really speaks, and we haven't talked about this in a long time. We're going back to like the early 10s and 20s episodes, but of your A-B concept, which maybe you want to reiterate to listeners who haven't been OGs.
Yes. It was enormously helpful for me to stop viewing my recovery as linear, trying to get from A to B. I'm in A and I'm trying to get to B, which is this recovered state, and rather seeing it as kind of moving between two states. So one state on one side, you've got like the binging, the relapse in the disordered eating. And on the other side over here, you've got a much more balanced, recovered state. The challenge with this is not turning the states into, oh, I'm in control over here and I'm out of control over here, because that can all be part of the same disordered eating cycle as well. And I think I've heard people kind of misunderstanding it a little bit like that. And so how it feels, I don't know about you, Steph, what your experience of relapses are, and I'd be interested to hear, but what it would feel like for me is that let's say I had a period of time where I was genuinely like working at my recovery. When I was back in the binge, I felt like I was back to square one. And it was devastating. I mean, absolutely. I'd feel hopeless. I'd feel like nothing was ever going to change. I'd be fighting this my entire life. It was awful. And so and I talk a lot with my clients about this, is actually in the recovery process, expecting that you're going to binge.
Yeah, for
And this
sure.
doesn't, but I think there's a lot of recovery programs that don't talk about it like this.
Oh,
Because
that's a setup, I think.
yeah, well, I think as well, like, if you take this idea of visualizing what you want, if you prepare and accept that you're going to binge at some point, are you then going to use it as an excuse to binge? I think that's the argument against it, which just doesn't chime with me.
No, I tell my clients to expect, like, and I don't see people using it as an excuse. To me, it's logical. It's just, of course, like you don't flip a switch, you're going to have things come up. And also there are opportunities to like work through. It's like, oh, there's some stuff here, or, like what's inspiring this that I need to look at more. I think if you're absent of a binge as you're recovering, you're not growing the muscles to deal with lapses. And you're not growing the muscles to deal with disappointment and these kinds of things, and how those things inspire the continuation of like meta binging or eating or restricting PS. So
Yeah.
restricting can also be, restrictive eating disorders can also have relapses in the same way, just the mirror image.
Yes. But that kind of shift in mentality for me made my recovery that much more secure and more stable and confident, because I could say, I know that if I were to relapse, that I could get myself back. Whereas before, I felt like recovery was figuring out how not to binge, sort of clinging on to that. Don't binge, don't binge. Recovery is how many binge-free days can I count? And I have it before. People feel like it's almost like this pressure building. I haven't binged for a while, but now I'm conscious that I haven't binged for a while.
Yeah.
And that makes me even more frightened of binging again, because it feels like that's the thing that means recovery's real. And I don't think that's helpful for people.
Not at all. My thoughts on this and my feelings on this are they black and white? They're very simplistic. I feel like I have a very logical way of thinking about it. That's completely not pathologizing it. It's more like, oh, what's going on? What's going on here that we need to be looking at? And almost like this is kind of the point. This is the stuff we do need to look at. If there's something that's creating a response that's bringing us to a place that we're trying to move away from, it's like, okay, well, great. What's here? Let's look at this. This is an opportunity. This just sounds like toxic positivity, but to me, it's like more matter of fact, kind of like, oh, there must be something happening. Also, though, I will say that during that first year of recovery, I remember, I probably told this before, but I started in June, and it was like this year-long process. And I was not really binging so much after 6 months to 9 months. Like binges were not really happening like that. But then in March, which was maybe 9 months in, I had this like series of binges throughout that month. And I do remember feeling nervous, like, oh no, like, what is this? And feeling a bit of that disappointment and stuff. And I was navigating this on my own. So I didn't have a voice in my ear saying, it's okay, like, that's all right, that's to be expected. But it passed, I think, because I was able to somehow say, like, okay, don't freak out. Just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. And I did. And that was the last time that happened. So I think about those as like these little brain blips, because I don't think that there was something going on that was like, oh, what's going on here? Because it didn't continue. It just kind of felt like my brain working some stuff out, or, just like, yeah, I don't know what it was. It could have been a number of things. But I think the key to it is simply not pathologizing it. That's hard, though. And I can respect that, like, you would get scared and that would be nerve wracking. But I think that when we fall into this, oh no place, that itself takes it in a new direction. That can be its own tornado that inspires more binging. Just, again, that meta sort of idea.
There was one for me, which I don't know if I've spoken about on the podcast. It's still one that it's interesting, really, that I have certain points in my recovery that, what it's like, you talk about a lot because it just comes out because it illustrates a point about recovery. And I've shared this on my YouTube channel, and I can't remember if I've spoken on the podcast, but I wrote my book, and writing the book was one of the most emotionally, energetically, psychologically demanding things I'd ever done. There was something that was so scary about putting it out, especially the last bit of editing it. Like, at what point is it done? Does it even make any sense to anybody else? Because it makes sense to me because I've written it, but you lose perspective when it's your own thing. So it felt huge. And I remember the book came out in January before lockdown. So that was 2020, 2019, 2020.
2020.
Yeah. It came out in the January. After I'd written my book, before it had come out, I had a massive binge. And I'd literally just written a book about recovering from binge eating and that I'd recovered. And I even went back. In fact, it was before it even was uploaded. It was before it was even fully typeset, because I had to go back into it to take out a sentence where I wrote I hadn't binged since this. And I had to take that sentence out of the book. That was a humbling experience. I'll tell you that much.
That makes me also question like the psychology of it. You know, like that part of you that's like, you're going to write a book about binge eating? Really? You know, let me just humble you a little bit. And you know that humility is one of your things.
Yeah.
I wonder if your brain was working for you in that way. Well, however you want to look at it. I was actually thinking, you know, when you're talking about these other ways that these things show up, last night I had these PRP shots in my knee. So my knee, I have 2 torn meniscus. What's the plural of meniscus? Menisci? Meniscuses?
Sure.
So I have 1 torn in each knee. So I'm instead of getting surgery, I'm getting these shots where basically what they have to do is take out a huge vial of your blood. They spin it, they centrifuge it, they separate the plasma from the red blood cells, and then they re-inject the plasma into your knee or whatever joint it is to heal itself. So I went last night and I was nervous to begin with, not because I'm afraid of needles or shots or anything like that, but just because I'm afraid of needles and shots in like bony areas where I'm like, oh, you're going to hit something you shouldn't be hitting. Like I have some trust issues with that. And I went in and I walked in and I saw this vial that they were going to take, because first they have to take your blood. And it was like, I've never seen a vial so big. They're taking like cups of my blood. And I don't like that. And then my health anxiety was like, and I was like, you know, I looked calm, cool, collected on the outside, but I think so much so that they were like, you okay? So like, yeah, just fine. Why do you say so?
Because you're not breathing.
Yeah, right. I wasn't talking or anything. And they take this blood, right? And oh God, I think as they're taking it, you know, there's one person who has to trigger warning for anyone who doesn't like, who gets squeamish about things. But, you know, like they're taking the blood, the one lady's taking it, and the other one is holding this huge vial because it has to be like handled, because it's like the flow, the pressure is such that it has to be, you know, mitigated. So there's 2 people trying to get this done. And the one is like, I'm getting some resistance. And I mean, I'm like, what does that mean? Does that mean that my blood, me being the hypochondriac I am, I'm like, does this mean that my blood's too sick? Exactly. What's this going to mean? And I have all these stories about what that means. So I'm sitting there in that moment, recognizing my nervous system right now is so hyperactive and so dysregulated. And this is something I do. This is something I talk about. I talk about managing these moments, right? Like this is part of my work. And I suppose my whole point of this is that like, I could have looked at that as like, oh, you talk about nervous system regulation and you talk about how to handle it. You offer people tools for this. And here you are in a moment where you need to recruit those tools and that regulation, and you can't. And you could look at that, and I could be tempted to think about that as a relapse, but like kind of well, maybe I don't really have it together the way that I thought I did. Here I am in a situation that would, you know, be asking for my healing, and it's not here. And I tried and I couldn't get out of it. And it was one of those things where I stopped resisting. And I was just kind of like, this is just what it is. My nervous system can't handle this right now. There's something about this. There's something about what's happening here that's pointing me in a direction of like, there's more to do around health anxiety. And it's interesting to me too. It's like, what else about this? What's threatening here in ways that I haven't really worked on yet? Because I've worked a lot on nervous system with my kids and with food and with my body image, but not really as much with health anxiety, although my health anxiety has gotten better. But it's like pointing me to like, there's more here. And it's not an indication that you haven't learned anything. This whole like day one idea when we binge again, it's like, I'm back to square one. I'm back to like day one of no binges. It's like, no, it's not like that in my mind. It's more like I still have good regulation in other areas. But in this moment, there's something happening that's suggesting that like there's a vulnerability. And that my body's responding the way it knows how to respond to vulnerability. I'm not regressing here. I'm not, all the other work I've done is not discounted, and it still applies in many other areas. It's just that it's pointing to me to something like this. And also like we're not perfect. I don't think I'm going to ever get to a place where I'm like, I can handle anything, you know? So that kind of idea, the concept of yourself as imperfect human being with vulnerability that if they're happening in a chronic and consistent way might be like pointing you towards an opportunity to look at something, is to me like how I would cope with something like that. You know, if it had been a binge, you know, if it had been something like that, it would be the same kind of idea where the way we're processing what's happening to us matters as much as what's happening to us, or matters more than what's happening to us, which is basically me reiterating what I said earlier in its story.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, what you were kind of saying, that voice that's coming in and going like, this is your thing. Like, you're not doing your thing. For me, there was a lot of shame that came about as a result of that. And then there was like a moment shortly after I was like, okay, like, how you going to handle this? What's happened is happened. What are you going to do now? Are you going to follow what you would say to someone else? Or are you going to try, I don't know what the alternative would be, turning into a meta binge, I guess. Or you're going to follow like basically what you've laid out in what you've just written about in your book. Are you going to follow that?
Right.
And I did, and I hadn't thought about it for a while. And I was thinking about it now as I'm talking about it, that happening was what made me go back into my book and take that piece out, where I'd basically announced that, oh, I've been binge free since this time. And I don't think that would have been a helpful thing for anyone else to have read.
Right.
Even from a comparison piece. I think actually that coming out of the book, even if it probably wasn't a helpful thing to put in the book anyway, that was probably coming from me trying to go, no, look, I've done this and I've got something to offer. Like that came from
ego
my need. Yeah, my need in the book, as opposed to actually is it the reader's need to know how long it's been and all of that.
And you're always checking your ego. Like you're very careful about that. You know, that's something very meaningful.
How many times do I miss it though? That's the...
Yes, but that's what you're afraid of. So it's so interesting that this happened, because it's almost like something in you was like, check your ego. Like forced you to do it.
Yeah. And I think it probably did influence then. I can't remember what videos I was making at the time, but it would have undoubtedly influenced my content at the time. I didn't declare it publicly at the time. Hey, guess what? Because I think that was just too vulnerable for me to do at that time when I was in it. I needed to kind of recenter, go back to basically what I'd just written, go back to that, practice that, embody that again, which was all I could do. But it's another reason why I go down this whole, I can't say I won't binge again. Because I did, when I did, I think I did say that recently. Like at one point I was having a more confident day, and I think I kind of said, no, I think I could say that now. And now I'm like, no, I'm just reminded of it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to say that now.
Maybe it was in the Back to Basics episode. I think we talked about that a little bit. Who knows what life situation would be so vulnerable that like these old things come back? I mean, like, I guess we can never say never. But also, I think that there's a case to be made for, barring major shifts inside or outside of in your life, that there's also some trust in when you've processed some of this stuff, including even just looking at diet culture's role in your body image and in your food rules and your food guilt. I think at some point, like, there's some stuff you can never unknow and unsee. And sometimes those are things that drive binges and restrictions in the first place. So I think there's multiple parts to it. Like there's different reasons we restrict. There's different reasons we binge. But some of those reasons, I think, in recovery really you can undo. And for that, I think that is a layer of protection that I personally feel. But I'm not saying that, if I woke up one day and felt depressed and didn't know why, which could happen, and went into that more bingey place of depression, like that different kind of binging that I experienced like in my 20s, that could be a vulnerability. And that couldn't, because that part didn't have to do with diet culture as much. That was a different thing.
I think the biggest game changer for anybody listening to this who might be in a relapse, or in the future you find yourself in a place where you feel like it's a relapse, it's the absolute game changer is that it doesn't inherently mean anything. We get to figure out what it means for us. So if I took the binge after I wrote my book, I can make that mean this is a reminder that this is something I'm vulnerable to, and to not be complacent. Like, that's the message of this binge. Or the message of this binge is to check my ego, because the minute I think that I'm invulnerable to this, that's what makes me more vulnerable to this. And by framing it like that, it's like, okay, there's a message here for me, and I can take the message and I can learn the lesson. And so then I can go, that was a good thing that happened, or that needed to happen, even if not a good thing, but like, I can see the benefit of that happening. And so that could even be as much as, and one of the ways I frame it a lot with my clients is that in a relapse, great, this is an opportunity to practice going from a place where you're feeling all out of balance to how do you find your feet again? Because learning that process, having that skill is the thing that will keep you safer than even binge urges just going away because you feel like you're eating enough, because a binge urge could pop up for another reason, possible. So that's the piece, it's the story. Whereas again, when you're going into a binge that turns to like days and weeks of binging, it would be, I'm not sure what the story would be quite, because I don't know that it was quite fully formed, but it would have been along the lines of, I'm so disappointed and ashamed in myself. I can't bear to be me. I can't bear to be in my own skin. I can't bear to be in my own mind. I need to just shut off. Like, at some point I'm going to have to come back and face what I've done, and I don't want to do that. And that for me is what make a lapse or a binge, let's say, turn into a much longer binge. That and the need, which almost sounds like the opposite, but I think maybe even both were going on at times, the need to kind of like overcorrect, to press the brakes too hard. That would be another thing as well.
You know, the concept we talk about, remembering and forgetting,
Mm-hmm.
again, for the benefit of those who haven't heard us talk about that, like this, how change happens, or how just being human involves some kind of like, we learn something and then we forget it. And then we're like, oh shoot, I forgot it. And then you like remember, and then, oh, and that this keeps happening. And I really see that remembering and forgetting as how we change over time. Like, it's almost part of that process, because for the reason that you're almost citing here around, there's something in forgetting and then remembering that's building a muscle of its own, even more so than the just initial learning of the concept in the first place. You know, it's really being able to say, I've lost touch with something, and having that awareness, and then being able to call it back in. That's its own thing. So I think that's a muscle that we build. And so working one-to-one with people, there are some people who I worked with 4 years ago, and they're good. And again, we don't know that it's a long distance, but it seems like my life has changed. Things are good. There's no relapsing. And there's other people who you work with, and there are times where you hear from them again. You're like, I think I need more support. I think I need something like that. And sometimes it's, I'm going to just use this one example of, like, there are some people I've worked with where it's almost like the thing that got them on their feet the most was connection. It was having someone to hold their hand. And that's what coaching is about. So it's like, there was this almost instinct inside of them of like, I need support. I need more connection to move through something. And sometimes when I will end with a client like that, I give them a little like virtual care package of, you know, taking these things forward, like remembering the things that have helped you, and the way that the things that have changed in this process, they include XYZ. And invariably it includes connection itself, right? So there's some people who don't forget that connection is one of the things that helped you get to this place of where you're now ready to sort of like go on. And I've watched people come back and when they come back, they're kind of like, I've lost that sense of connection, with a sense of really feeling like supported by someone. So sometimes a relapse can be this remembering. It's like, oh, yes, that's the thing that I've lost touch with, because that tends to happen with us, where we sort of get into patterns with ourselves. And sometimes we revert to these old patterns. And then we're like, the relapse is that indication of what's missing now that we've been holding on to, and we've forgotten it. And it's this callback to remembering. And in that, I think, like, again, I've worked with people like that, a second round almost, where it's like, that's also reinforcing. It's kind of like, yes, this is something we need. And this is something we need outside of just this relationship. This is something we need in life. And sometimes it takes a few times to be like, I really do need that. And I need to figure out I really need to make that a priority. sometimes it takes a lot of remembering and forgetting in all things, for myself too. Burnout is an example where I burn out over and over again. And then I'm like, I really need more boundaries with X, Y, and Z. And it takes me several rounds to really prioritize it. And I think that can be also a way of looking at relapse, where it's like, what's the thing that we're forgetting that we need to remember more? And that, sometimes it's going to take a few rounds of it.
I used to just get so frustrated with myself every time I forgot, because I think I thought for the longest time that I should be able to remember, and that even the act of forgetting was somehow some kind of personal failing. And coming to accept that that's not the case. And again, I shared with you before, like Katie Barbara, however you say the name.
Barbaro.
I always forget.
Like Barbara with an O.
Yeah. She was the one who, said to me first about life just being a process of forgetting and remembering. I was like, oh yeah, that is just the human condition. And I'd prefer it not to be that, but when I accept it's the human condition and that I am a human, I can steer myself away from an unhealthy level of self-blame for it, and start appreciating myself every time I remember. And that's the difference now with certain things. When I remember, I feel this surge of appreciation for myself that I remembered.
Just want to give a little shout out to Katie, because we've mentioned her like three different episodes.
Yeah.
And she used to speak about eating disorder recovery, but she's since sort of gone her own path with it. And now she talks about, and she is on Instagram, just for anyone who's interested, making love with life, alchemizing shadows through creativity. So she's all about creativity and remembering through creativity, perhaps. You might think of it like that. So hey, Katie, thanks for the
She's very
forgetting
artsy.
content. Very artsy. Yeah, she had an illustrated book on eating disorder recovery. That's how I knew her in the first place. I think you too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we could talk about what if you are relapsing, like what would be some things to do.
Yes. Anchor meals.
Yeah. Yes. That's actually a big one. People lose touch with that. I think sometimes because you're like, all right, I don't need that regularity of eating as much anymore. But then that can become dysregulated quickly if we let it go too much. Yes, bringing back anchor meals, I would say, is one of the most basic practical things to do. That could be very helpful. I've watched that happen. It's like that is enough to help with that sense of scarcity in the body that could create binge urges.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that was my one. What's your one?
Yeah, I got one. Like returning to your why. Mm-hmm. So that's why we decide to recover in the first place, because otherwise we wouldn't, And so there's got to be some real connection to this why I want to recover. That again, once you start, once you feel more stable in a recovery process, eventually you might lose more touch with the why, because there's lots of forces pulling against it about why we should be restricting, or why we should be back in diet culture, why we should be trying to lose weight. And those pulls can take you further and further away from your why, because the why is the big pull against all that in the first place. So revisiting that can be a big one.
You talk about feeling like you relapse with the burnout thing. It's like you keep coming back to it and it's like, I'm back here again. So I sometimes feel like I slip into these dopamine chasing cycles. That's what it feels like. It feels like I just have to be distracted all the time. And my mind is sort of jumping from one thing, and then I'm hyper-focused and then I'm not focused. It's almost like if you looked at the behavior, it could look like ADHD. And I'll tell you in a minute why I don't think it is. Mm-hmm. And so it will show up in a few different things. It will show up with scrolling. I had 2 nights this week. And Steph, I am so boundaried around watching reels. I generally don't watch them unless they're just naturally coming up on my feed. Mm-hmm. I don't do the scrolling through reels. But 2 nights in a row, I ended up in a reel hole, and unable to put it down and go to sleep. So I went to bed way later than normal. I found myself struggling to get into bed. And that's when I normally know it's got a little bit too far. It's like I'm hooked into it. And to unhook myself is painful. It feels like it's a physical discomfort. And I noticed it feels like the same cycle that I would sometimes do in a series of binges. And so one of the things that would help me would be to have a day, fewer distractions. So it might be not having a podcast on, not watching TV. And so there were 2 things I did last night, and I can literally feel like the cycle's broken today. I just feel different. And the
like
2
a
things
dopamine fast?
Yeah, that word, I don't know, kind of like, I don't know.
We're not talking about, we're not on a food fast. But the
it's like
idea of a
break.
dopamine fast is to retrain that pain-pleasure balance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's to deliberately withhold yourself from the dopamine seeking behaviors. Now, the problem is when you try and do that with food, is you get in a fight with your
Yes.
appetite.
Right.
That's the problem there.
Yes.
So I've literally just recorded a video about this morning from my YouTube channel. I'm quite excited about it because I just was really enthusiastic about the subject. And yesterday morning, I messaged my friend and I said, been doing this thing with my reels when I get into bed. I've been going on social media and I'm struggling to get myself into bed. I said, I'm telling you this because I'm making a commitment to myself that when I get into bed tonight, I will not open any social media apps when I get into bed. And so there was something about the intentionality. It doesn't have to be to another person, but that just really helped me. And then the other thing was I got on the yoga mat. And again, I had that feeling where I was like, I didn't really want to be on the yoga mat. I just wanted to do something quickly, or I might do something that's more strength-based as well, because I don't want to be slow, basically. And when I was scrolling through, I looked for connection was the word I was searching on Yoga with Cassandra's page, because I was like, I could tell I need to like reconnect with myself here because I'm just keep wanting to get away. It's that same trying to like leave myself feeling. And one of the ones that came up was 15 minutes of breath work. And I was like, sit here and do 15 minutes of breath work instead of yoga. Like that sounded horrendous. So I was like, I got to do it. And so I did that instead. I sat there on the mat and I did the yoga breathing exercises. And it really did. One, it changed my physical state, but it just brought me into a much more centered place. And so I can feel like I switch into a different part of my brain.
Yeah. What if you have resistance what if that gets in the way of completing that task?
Oh, it absolutely does. Like it had been for the last few days. And it's often, this is what I mean about it almost feeling like a relapse, because I'm never getting the satisfaction. It's like I'm trying to chase something, which is why it feels like it might be in the dopaminergic.
Yeah, I think dopamine I think it really is. It's probably going to have something to do with relapsing. And again, I don't think you can correct dopamine through food, like the dopamine that comes through food. I think we need to leave that out to your point of this conversation. But I think this idea of redistributing that pain-pleasure balance is absolutely relevant, like probably to relapses.
When I was using the food more in these cycles, by breaking it somewhere else, because it would be showing up, it wasn't just with food, It was showing up in distraction and other things like that. By breaking it somewhere else, the food got easier.
Yeah.
But it wasn't using food as the focal point to break it, because there's too much resistance, too much conflict there. It's not the place. So when you mention the resistance, it's almost like, where's the place of least resistance? The place of least resistance is going, okay, I can make a commitment not to open social media when I get into bed. Okay. In that moment when I was on the yoga mat, I just had a moment. It was like a flash of insight and self-awareness was like, that's the one you don't want to do. That's the one I think you need to do.
Yeah. Yes. So to find your just right challenge for that.
And again, this is why I say relapse, because sometimes I can't find the willingness straight away.
Yeah.
I can kind of see it and I still can't unhook myself.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm saying I wouldn't classify it as ADHD is because I feel like I have a dopamine reward system that can get dysregulated. We all do, but I feel like mine maybe is more than average, but who knows? So I would have previously said, I've just got a bit of an addictive personality. I don't use that language now because I don't think it's helpful. But I can break it and then I can regulate and have longer periods of regulation. If we're talking ADHD here, and this is how your brain operates, it's not like you can just break the cycle and your brain just balances out. And I think that's the difference. But the behavior looks like ADHD behavior because of the dopamine disruption.
Totally agree. Want to shout out to those of you listening with ADHD where that tool is not going to be like as accessible. It's going to like be harder to do something like that. But another place that I would look at if in a relapse situation is boundaries, like where the boundaries have been compromised. And I would further that to say, if you are in a binge pattern relapse, to look at where your boundaries have become too porous. And I say binge pattern without the restrict. So if you're in a strictly binge pattern that feels like a strictly binge pattern, where are your boundaries too porous? Looking at that. And if you're more in a restrict or binge restrict relapse, to look at where your boundaries are too rigid or where that might be relooked at. The reason I'm saying that as far as because it goes with that remembering and forgetting, I think those of us who have different attachment styles, we talked about in episode 148, which was just a couple of weeks ago. Your attachments, I mean, this is so old and so deep rooted that we can do lots of work around it, but it might be the default pattern. So when we're going back to default patterns, we tend to go more, rigid or porous with our boundaries depending if we're avoidant or anxious or disorganized. And so that might just creep up again. And it might need to reassert okay, where are my boundaries at? Where are they starting to get to this or to that? Oftentimes I find that that's a lot to do with where then eating becomes the same pattern, we're becoming too porous or too rigid there.
Well, so if someone then, okay, let's say someone's like, oh, I think my boundaries are too porous. What do? Tell me exactly how to fix this problem.
Well, I mean, come on. I think that should be an episode, to be honest. I think we should do a boundaries series. But if your food boundaries feel porous, likely, possibly, your boundaries in life are porous, right? So maybe we are taking on too much at work. Maybe we are being really people-pleasy with our mom or our friend, or maybe we are like taking on too much of the household work and our partner isn't contributing and we're just sort of like being passive-aggressively resentful about that, these kinds of things. Like looking at where those patterns exist in your relationships with people or things. And even just having clarity on that, again, is so helpful because you're like, yeah, I do actually feel resentful. A lot of times binges come from resentment, and so does restriction. So it's like looking at what am I actually feeling resentful about, or where are my boundaries getting crossed so chronically that but it's just not in my conscious awareness so much. It's just part of it's part of just like how life is, or how I think I am, or this is how that person is. And we're collecting a lot of resentment about that. And then that shows up through these binges. So even just naming it.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked the question as well is because it can sound like, oh, I have porous boundaries with food. Are you saying that I need stronger boundaries with food? Do I need to put some rules in or things like that? And that's why I mention it, because it basically just links to what I was just saying about the dopamine circuit. It's like if this porous boundaries is playing out with food, if that's the pattern, you're going to see it in other areas of your life.
Right.
Go there first.
Correct. That's what I meant by that.
It will make the food easier if you start with the food.
Yeah, don't even address the food first. My suspicion is that with relapsing, unless we're talking about blatant, like where anchor meals would be the key, right? The physiological reason for the relapse. Sometimes we relapse because of other life circumstances that are saying, hey, I need attention. And it's addressing those life circumstances, because addressing the food is just sometimes the voice, the spokesman, it's just the megaphone.
It's trying to understand what's the message here, because a relapse has happened for a reason. And the worst thing is if we can't find the reason, we have no idea, we can't make any sense of why we've relapsed. The only conclusion we can come to is like, well, I'm just screwed up. I'm just broken.
I'm hopeless.
And that I think is where a lot of people land. And I'll be honest, like I went through that in that January 2020, probably a couple of days of feeling like, no, I am so broken. I need to pull this book. I can't publish a book. I should close down my Instagram channel. I should tell my clients I can't work with them anymore. I should do all of that. Catastrophic thinking came in as well. And kind of there was an energy working through in that. So what do you make of that? Because the catastrophic reaction, when I think about how that shows up now, it happens, but it almost helps me work through something, but I don't even know how. So I haven't got the language for this, but you're about to say something and I feel like you're going to clear it all up for me.
Well, I feel like the catastrophic reaction is your defense mechanism. It's your default protection, potentially. I mean, for some people, we talk about that as a trauma response, but there's levels of that, right? So it's your emotional response, it's your protection. But you have done a lot of work on recognizing that. So you're not inside of it. You're able to see it, and you've developed tools for yourself that include self-compassion, consistency. Like you've done that pre-work. So when you experience catastrophizing now, you were like, oh right, I've got a whole map for this because I've sort of worked that out really well. Even though the defense mechanism still comes up, you know the doorway to go through to get out of that. Whereas I think before doing some of this work, the defense mechanism comes up for people, and they're still in it. They're still like right inside of it, and they haven't like necessarily worked that through. And that's why relapsing is the fact that there's a recovery in the first place means that there has been some stuff to work through, and then we forget it. And it's like that remembering, like, how did I work through that the first time? Like, what's it that got me out of that Right. I got to apply those things again. I got to go back to self-compassion. I got to go back to these tools that I have. And I think you're probably much more easily able to do that now because you did that pre-work.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it's not
There's
like
a
you're
little
not
bit that's
vulnerable
still,
anymore.
well, yeah, there's still a little bit that's of me that's saying, well, I should realize the second the catastrophic thinking comes out and find the way out. And it still sometimes has to
10 years
just
time.
do its thing. There is one thing that I do want to, I alluded to it earlier, and I think it's important to stress and maybe even talk about a little bit, is there will probably be people listening who are in the binge restrict cycle who will say, when I'm binging, I'm relapsed. When I'm restricting, that's recovery. That's me where I should
Being
be.
healthy.
Yes. And that I think is the,
Yeah.
and
That's
I
not
would
what
have
we're talking about here.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. That is
Watching.
all part of still being in disorder. So if you're in a restrictive place and you have alternating binge restrict cycles, the binge cycles, they're less desirable, but they're not less disordered. I'm sorry, they're not more disordered.
I guess there wasn't a lot to say about that, but just
it's important, so important. It should have gone at the beginning. But maybe it's more contextualized now. Okay. Well, if you need help and support through a relapse, please come on over and join our community because we have lots of people who are navigating all sorts of stages of their recovery in there to help.
I also have a number of videos on my YouTube channel about relapse. So if in a moment when you feel like you've blown it, you might want to watch one of those. It might help you to recenter, recover quicker. I'd like to think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Okay.
See you on the other side.
Bye-bye.
Bye.